Thanksgiving Day in Westlake Hills. Austin felt like it always did, too much silver polish in the air, too many casseroles battling for oven space, and the good china my mother only brought out when image mattered more than comfort. The dining room smelled like rosemary and heat, and the table was heavy with options. No one had actually asked for 5 kinds of mustard for 1 turkey, 3 different cranberry relishes, and bread rolls that looked like they had been auditioning for a photograph. My mother Linda wore pearls that did not catch light so much as command it, and every time she lifted her chin they flashed a small white warning. My father Tom presided from the head of the table as if he had built it with his hands instead of paying for it with other people's obedience. My sister Melissa arrived late, apologizing to a reflection in the hall mirror, then slid into a seat without looking at me. You could say this was our ordinary moment, but ordinariness is only the costume of control, and that evening control was getting dressed in a hurry. I had spent years translating chaos into order for everyone but myself. At work, I was an operations and process engineer at a small logistics startup where we measured success in minutes saved and routes optimized, and I loved that math because it could not be gaslit. At home, I was the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who drove my father to breakfasts with men who wore identical watches, the one who edited my mother's social posts so they sounded generous instead of hungry, the one who lent Melissa a card for a day or two, and ended up paying a bill because family is not a debt you can send to collections. I sent small transfers to keep the peace-friendly messages to patch the story, and I told myself it was easier this way. That is what people like my parents count on, that your desire for love will outrun your need for self-preservation. On the surface, we were a Chamber of Commerce family, smiling photos with local leaders, clever captions about giving back, and a holiday table that photographed beautifully. Underneath, there was a price list. The moment it tilted arrived in the middle of the mashed potatoes. My father waited until I had a fork halfway to my mouth, then asked with the casual tone men use when they have already decided what you will say for my online banking password. He framed it as transparency, as if families should not have secrets. He said it the way he used to ask me to fetch his briefcase, like a task I owed him for being alive. The table did not even blink. My mother sipped her wine and admired the stemware. Melissa admired herself. I put my fork down slowly because if I moved too fast, I knew the room would shift, and I had trained myself to keep the room steady. I smiled because niceness is often the only safe pocket you have in a house where truth is expensive. I said I would log in later and show him whatever he needed. I turned the demand into an offer, and you could feel the air release the way it does when a plane lands and everyone pretends to be fine. My mother tilted her pearls, looked straight through me, and murmured that line she thinks is clever, the one she repeats like a lesson parasites should learn to obey. She did not mean it as a joke. She meant it as a scripture. If you want to understand the rhythm of my family, imagine a metronome that ticks for reputation instead of time. Every question is a test. Every favor is an invoice. In that room, a refusal is not a boundary. It is an attack. So I did what I had always done. I breathed, I smiled, and I made a note. It is amazing what notes can become when you stack them: receipts, patterns, then a plan. But I am getting ahead of myself. That evening, I performed competence, which is what people like me do when we are afraid we stage manage our own denial. I asked if anyone wanted more gravy. I offered to slice what was left of the turkey because my father likes the neatness of uniform pieces. I asked Melissa about a boutique event she had been buzzing about, and she told me it would be the kind of room where real opportunities happen, the kind of room where everyone knows who matters. She said she needed a short-term loan to confirm a block of tickets before prices changed. She said the word loan like a compliment, then looked past me toward the sideboard as if the answer might be stored in the silver drawer. I said we could discuss it after dessert. I did not say that loans only count when the lender gets repaid. People talk about fight or flight, but there is a third way: observe. The longer you learn to hold your breath, the easier it is to notice who inhales for you. My father loved the attention of men who make introductions sound like knighthoods, and he was already rehearsing how he would be announced at the downtown hotel next month when the chamber would gather for a winter gala. My mother loved an ending that looked like a success story: a daughter who smiles on cue, a son-in-law who nods a board seat that proves she raised a leader. Melissa loved the feeling of arriving with a guest list that could not say no. Me, I loved the silence right before the truth enters a room because once it does, there is no costume that fits it. I had spent years building systems that moved trucks and packages through cities without wasting seconds. That kind of work rewires you. It teaches you that problems are not storms, they are routes. They have choke points. They have false turns. They have solutions if you are patient and if you gather the right data. So I apologized for being tired, stacked dishes into the sink with a grace that reads as gratitude and kissed my mother on the cheek that always leaned away first. My father clapped my shoulder with the camaraderie he saves for the reliable. Melissa asked me to text her later about the tickets, that there was a deadline she could not miss. The night wound down with the practiced choreography of a family that believes it is a brand. When I finally stepped into the cold air outside and felt it press a clear line across my teeth, an old ache flickered and went quiet again. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the easiest lie I know, that keeping the peace is the same as being safe. But here is what they did not know, and what I would not say out loud. Yet I had already started counting, and counting is a kind of prayer. It turns fear into steps. It turns humiliation into a map. And once you have a map, you do not beg for directions. You choose a destination and walk there even if everyone you love is pointing the other way. I will tell you why that small decision at the table mattered more than any speech. For now, it is enough to say, this I smiled, I served pie, and I began. The morning after Thanksgiving moved like honey, slow and sticky, as if the house wanted to hold the night's performance in place. My phone chimed with a message from my father, written in that gentle tyranny. He favors a reminder that he would need my online banking access so he could keep an eye on things, followed by a second note that read almost kindly that he might call my manager to clear up questions about what I do with company property. There it was, the old weapon polished and placed back in my hand for inspection. He has always believed my paycheck is a leash, that my career only exists because he allows it to exist. I typed and deleted a dozen replies before landing on the safest sentence: I know I will log in and show you later. It is astonishing how harmless a deferral sounds when you are trying not to bleed. My mother added a voice note that was half purr, half blade, suggesting that family transparency builds trust, then repeated her favorite catechism about parasites and obedience. I stared at the ceiling and counted the tiny hairline cracks running like rivers above the bed. Counting steadied me. Counting always has. By afternoon, Melissa was already in motion the way she is when a plan requires someone else's pocket. She called to say a boutique brand had offered her a cluster of coveted passes if she could put down a fully refundable deposit by end of day, and would I be a lifesaver and lend her a card just until Monday. She always made it sound like a compliment to be chosen for exploitation. I said we could discuss it after I saw the paperwork, and she laughed the way a cat laughs at a closed door. Her patterns had stopped being fog and started being data, small purchases that became larger purchases, charges that slipped through as trials and returned as subscriptions, a chorus of contested transactions that made my bank treat me like a rumor. In America, numbers have reputations, and reputations accumulate like lint. Enough chargebacks and your name starts tripping alarms you cannot see. The simple idea that money is math dissolves when your creditworthiness becomes a story other people tell about you. Watching Melissa perform concern over my credit while setting the table for its ruin was like watching someone light candles in a room you know is soaked in gasoline. Memory is not a timeline, it is a lightning strike. One moment I was staring at my coffee, and the next I was back on a gravel shoulder a few winters ago, the air cold enough to turn my breath into small ghosts. We had been driving home from another spectacle, a holiday party, where my father introduced himself as if the host had discovered him. Something minor flickered into something major. His voice rose, mine did not, and then his fist spoke a language my mouth could not answer. The crack was quick, merciless, almost efficient. I remember the taste of iron, and a stupid thought about how snow would make the blood look cinematic if we lived anywhere else. I remember my mother's breathy insistence that I apologize for being dramatic, and Melissa sighing that I always make everything about me. I remember paying a dentist bill with the savings I had hidden from everyone, and I remember the new tooth feeling like a secret I had to clench. That night built a second spine inside me, a quiet one made of resolve. It taught me that sound can be a trap and silence can be a tool. I learned to step sideways when a room tried to make me vanish to observe the small tells other people think are invisible. Back in the present, the tells were everywhere once I let myself see them. My father's calendar filled with breakfasts and golf teas and private meetings with men who pronounced neighbor like investor, and each conversation ended with a casual mention of the Chamber of Commerce board vote as if it had already happened. My mother practiced a toast in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening, a little speech about leadership and legacy that tasted like frosting and pre-written history. Melissa kept rehearsing the story of her upcoming event, which would take place in the kind of room she said matters, by which she meant a room where mirrors are more important than doors. The neighbors waved from driveways and sent over muffins and tidbits, part kindness and part reconnaissance. And the Homeowners Association president made a point of asking how proud we all must be, then glanced at my car as if pride could be measured in payments. In a community like ours, the currency is not dollars, it is reputation, and reputations are stitched together with favors and silence. My family cultivated both. So I did what I do best. I began to document the world exactly as it was, instead of as my parents needed it to appear. I printed receipts and filed them by vendor signature and time. I forwarded emails to a private address and exported the metadata because facts wrapped in context are harder to bend. I requested official copies of my credit reports and read them line by line like a detective learning a dialect. I reviewed text threads and saved voice notes. I answered every demand with kindness and asked for clarifying details, which is a polite way to ask for a confession. Each interaction became a ledger entry. Each ledger became a map. I did not threaten. I did not warn. I simply made the truth easier to carry. At night, I walked the loop around Lady Bird Lake and rehearsed calm answers to future accusations. In the space between footfalls, I understood something simple and enormous. I did not have to outshout anyone. I only had to outlast their performance and outdocument their story. They thought I was obedient because I was quiet. They would learn quiet is not the same as compliant. And what they could not imagine not yet was how a pile of ordinary papers could turn into a single, extraordinary envelope. I will tell you about that envelope soon. For now, know this, the pattern had surfaced, and my patience had teeth. Strategy did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like breath I finally allowed myself to take. The morning after those messages, I sat at my small kitchen table with a legal pad and a mug that had outlived nicer cups, and I wrote 2 columns what they could take and what they could not. Money can be seized. Reputations can be bruised. But authorship, when it is documented properly, becomes a wall even relentless hands cannot climb. I looked at the quiet code I had been building at night, the routing logic that shaved waste from messy city maps, and I understood that protecting this work was not arrogance. It was oxygen. For years, my father had threatened to speak to my employer as if human resources were his private bellhop. If he wanted to swing at my job again, I would make sure he hit a shield and not my chest. That was the day survival stepped back and strategy took the wheel. I reached out to Trent, the colleague who has that rare gift of confirming what you already know without making you feel foolish for knowing it late. We met at a diner that smelled like burned coffee and sugar, the kind of place where the menu plastic creaks when you open it. I told him I needed 2 things, a lawyer who speaks fluent technology, and a way to make certain that my off-hours project remained mine, regardless of any storms my family tried to summon. Trent listened. He did not gasp or overreact or try to fix the story with a platitude. He simply nodded and said very evenly that he would introduce me to someone he trusted and that we would move carefully because careless paperwork is a back door you do not see until it opens under your feet. When he said we, I felt the floor settle. Then he told me something quiet people often forget. Documentation is not confrontation, it is preparation. I paid for our breakfast because I needed to buy myself the memory of taking action. The lawyer's office was a converted bungalow not far from South Congress. Sunlight pooled on a long table, and the walls were lined with books that looked read instead of displayed. She asked me to start at the beginning, not of the code, but of the pattern. And when she heard the shape of the threats my family favored, she did not roll her eyes or apologize for them. She drew a box on a yellow pad and wrote the word boundary inside. Then we built the fence. She walked me through a provisional patent, which is a formal way of timestamping an invention while you refine it, and she made sure the application would establish me, and only me, as the inventor of record. We listed the devices on which I had written the code, the dates and times I had committed changes, and the places where I had tested dummy data to prove I had not touched company assets. She drafted non-disclosure agreements for any future demonstration, so curiosity would not erode protection. She explained the invention assignment language common in employment contracts and helped me review my documents line by line. The goal was simple truth that could hold up when someone tried to twist it. When we were done, she printed a short plain notice I could give my manager and the Human Resources Department, stating that I was developing an independent project off company time on personal equipment without company data, and that any demonstrations would be covered by non-disclosure agreements. It was not a warning, it was a light left on in the hallway. Walking out of that bungalow, Austin felt brighter, in that particular winter way where the air is crisp but not cruel. I carried a folder that was thinner than my fear had predicted and heavier than it looked. I went back to my apartment and opened a new cloud drive solely for proof. I created plain-named folders because clever names become puzzles you cannot solve when you are scared. I added receipts and annotated them with notes about who asked, when they asked, and what story they used to make. The requests sound normal. I exported email metadata and saved it because context is a kind of armor. I backed up phone records. I made 2 copies and stored one in a place my family did not know existed because redundancy is kindness to your future self. Then I called Callie. Callie is the sort of friend who shows up with snacks and highlighters and refuses to be thanked because gratitude is not the point. She sat on my floor with a stack of envelopes and built an index like it was a campfire warming the cold ache of details with the glow of order. She labeled everything without commentary, which is sometimes the purest form of love. When I faltered, she gave me a look that translated to keep going. We talked about nothing and everything while we worked about music, about the man she was not texting back, about the way Austin blooms in wildflowers, when spring finally decides to stop teasing. And in the spaces between, we made a plan for continuity. If anything unpleasant happened, she would have access to the documents and the calendar, and she would know who to contact at the firm and at my office. Saying it out loud felt like packing an emergency bag you hope you never touch. I kept interacting with my family exactly as they preferred, but with a change they would not notice. Each request from them now landed in a written channel, and each reply from me included a short, cheerful confirmation of the terms. When Melissa floated the idea of a deposit for the event again, I asked for an invoice on letterhead and typed the words "temporary loan" in the message memo, then saved a screen capture of the exchange. When my father hinted about my finances, I offered an appointment to review budget categories with him in person and then summarized the offer in writing. When my mother sent voice notes about transparency, I transcribed them and filed the text next to the audio. None of it was a threat. All of it was a record. And while I created those tidy lines, I kept sending small kindnesses on purpose flowers, delivered with a sunny card, a cheerful reply to a neighbor's inquiry, a ride to an appointment. It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes the softest touch reveals the hardest truth, because it strips away the excuse that you were cruel. There was one more quiet step I took that week, a step that looked like a gift. I ordered a small smart doorbell for my parents under the banner of safety. I framed it as a seasonal kindness, an upgrade to ease holiday deliveries, and discourage porch pirates, a thoughtful present from a dutiful daughter. I told my mother she could personalize the chimes. I told my father the device would make the house look modern. And on a private page of my notes, I wrote the only sentence that mattered: the microphone will remember what people try to forget. I will tell you later how that little box altered a room they thought belonged to them. For now, understand this: by the 3rd week the scaffolding was up. The legal fence stood, the archive thickened, and for the first time in my life the word no began to feel less like a danger and more like a door I knew how to close gently. The envelope was not ready yet, but its edges had started to appear. Quiet does not mean idle. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, I practiced a careful choreography that looked like obedience and functioned like distance. I kept the texts chipper, the calls brief, and the replies written. When my father asked again about oversight, I offered a future afternoon to review spending categories together, then summarized the offer in a sunny email that turned his demand into a calendar note I could later print. When my mother pressed her favorite sermon about family transparency, I thanked her for the guidance and asked her to list exactly what information would make her feel secure, then filed her voice note beside my transcript. And when Melissa floated another request for a short-term card loan, I asked for an invoice on letterhead and placed the words "temporary loan" inside the message like a bell I planned to ring later. Outwardly, I played the dutiful daughter and reliable sister. Inwardly, I tracked how every sentence fit into a ledger. I sent small transfers by Zelle or Venmo that could pass for seasonal kindness, not because they deserved them, but because those tiny amounts bought me a very specific commodity time and the illusion that I was still asleep. I wrapped the doorbell in brown paper and red twine and delivered it to my parents' porch with a handwritten card about safety and holiday packages. My mother loved the idea that the chime could play a quaint melody. My father loved that it made the house look current. I loved that the audio backed up to a cloud I owned. The first week produced ordinary footage, the mail carrier humming a delivery driver, apologizing to no one for running late, 2 dogs arguing about a squirrel. Then the front walk turned into a tiny stage. Neighbors stepped into the frame to drop off cookies and gather gossip. The Homeowners Association president complimented the wreath, then asked in a bright whisper how preparations for the Chamber of Commerce Gala were coming along and whether the board seat was a done deal. My mother laughed in that polished way that sounds like a compliment to herself and said softly but clearly that my father had already earned his place. She added that certain neighbors benefit from guidance, and my father replied that he knew how to help people vote the right way when money was involved. They were not speaking about politics, they were speaking about access. Who receives invitations? Who receives contracts? Who receives forgiveness? Hearing it play back later, I did not feel surprised. I felt confirmed. Melissa's storyline began unraveling with the kind of confidence that only people who have never heard the word no can carry. She called at odd hours with a breathless list of must-have purchases for a hush-hush preview night that would place her in the company of brand directors and influencers. She needed a temporary charge to secure a block of entries and a suite, she said, and the deposit would of course be refunded within days. Her words were polished. Her math was not. The invoices she sent bore mismatched fonts and a tax identification number that did not line up with the venue. I asked for the event coordinator by name and copied the venue's general address on a cheerful email. The reply that came back could have been written in ice. There was no suite block under Melissa's name. The event used a fraud prevention tool that ranked registrants by risk, and her prior history with charge disputes had placed her on a watch list. I thanked them for the clarity, saved the exchange, and forwarded it to a folder labeled with nothing dramatic, just the date. Numbers tell stories if you let them finish their sentences. I pulled bank statements that tracked the charity account my parents liked to feature in glossy captions. At first glance, everything gleamed deposits after fundraisers, transfers to partner organizations, notes that sounded benevolent. But buried between tidy outflows were small temporary moves into a personal account that matched Melissa's bank. They were not enormous, which is why they passed the quick glance test. They were constant, which is why they mattered. I printed the pages circled nothing and wrote in pencil along the margin the way an engineer annotates a network map frequency direction, probable endpoint. I did not judge. I did not inflame. I built a timeline that would not wobble when I held it up to air. Meanwhile, the household theater continued as if the understory did not exist. My father practiced anecdotes that placed him at the center of other people's success, polishing them for a microphone he had not yet been handed. My mother tried on toasts in the kitchen, pausing after certain words to imagine applause, her pearls a metronome for ambition. Melissa posted filtered near announcements, coy, about details bloated with promise. Neighbors brought by little gifts, with big questions tucked under the ribbon, and the Homeowners Association president sent a cheerful note about parking logistics for the gala, as if our street were part of the event's set design. I smiled and waved, and kept every reply benevolent, because sometimes the most strategic thing you can do is to give people enough rope to fashion the costume they plan to be seen in. I kept giving too by design. A bouquet here, a ride there, a text that blessed my parents' plans, a link to an article about philanthropy governance that I presented as admiration rather than warning. Each kindness quieted suspicion, and every quieted suspicion bought another hour to gather context. Callie came over on weeknights with markers and snacks, and we built little islands of order on my living room floor. We named folders like plain sandwich bread. We tested the cloud backups twice. We wrote a simple, clear summary for my manager and for the Human Resources Department that explained my independent project in calm, ordinary words. It read like a hallway light, not a siren. And because quiet revenge is more craft than spectacle, I invested in stillness. No threats, no deadlines. Only momentum, the sort you feel in your bones when a plan begins to hum. But here is what they did not know, and this part matters. The doorbell that made their entryway sound delightful had captured 2 short conversations that told the whole story without flourish. In one, my parents discussed shifting a small charity expense to a personal card just for the weekend, then paying it back later when no one was looking. In another, my father instructed Melissa to ask me for a temporary card because she will feel guilty if you call it a loan. The word temporary is a hinge. It turns theft into favor if no one checks the hinges. I checked. I recorded. I breathed. I let the evidence get heavy enough to speak for itself. The winter gala was approaching, a December promise threaded through our neighborhood like fairy lights. My father kept saying the phrase board vote as if the syllables belonged to him. My mother rehearsed her smile for the camera she believed would find her. Melissa insisted her event would eclipse them all. I cleaned my kitchen table, laid out a single manila envelope, and wrote one name on it in neat letters, Mr. Keller. I will explain in the next part why that ordinary envelope mattered more than any speech I could give. For now, understand this. The mask had set, the stage was lit, and the smallest sounds in a front doorway were about to echo in a ballroom. I approached the plan like an engineer and a survivor at the same time, which is to say, I cared about structure and mercy in equal measure. On a clean kitchen table, I placed one plain manila envelope, and beside it the pieces that would become a single voice when assembled, printed bank movements from the charity account mapped in order transfers that slipped into my sister's personal account arranged by date, a short transcript of the 2 front door conversations with clear time markers in words, a selection of receipts tied to the requests my parents called temporary, and one photograph of my broken tooth taken the week it happened. I did not circle or underline anything. Drama is a costume, and I needed the truth to walk into a room in its own clothes. Each page received a small footer with the month spelled out, and the day written in words not for spectacle, but for clarity. Facts travel farther when they do not shout. Before I slid anything inside the envelope, I pressure-tested my own ethics, because revenge that betrays your values is just another trap. I had already confirmed that the smart doorbell captured audio and video on my parents' property with their knowledge and blessing, and that what it recorded in the front approach was not a private conversation snatched from behind a wall, but neighborly exchanges offered in a doorway. I did not need to stretch the truth. I needed to show it. I did not edit the audio beyond transcription, and in the margins I noted only the simplest context, who spoke where they stood, and which line revealed the engine of entitlement. One line from my father instruct Melissa to use the word loan because I will feel guilty. One line from my mother, certain neighbors benefit from guidance. If a single sentence can carry a house, these were load-bearing. Then I thought about the audience. A revelation is only as effective as the room that hears it. The Chamber of Commerce Gala would gather the very people my parents had worked so hard to impress: small business owners, committee chairs, the hosts who curate civic stories. At the center of that gathering stood Mr. Keller, the chamber president, a man who keeps his words precise and his calendars tighter than his smiles. He was not my confessor. He was a steward of the room. If the board was about to vote on my father's name, then silence from me would be consent. I addressed the envelope by hand, printing his name with the same neatness I used on my engineering diagrams, and I wrote nothing in the return address space, because this was not a conversation, and it was not a plea, it was a delivery. Logistics became their own calm ritual. I prepared 3 identical packets, one for Mr. Keller at the gala, one to be couriered to the chamber office the following morning, and one sealed for my own records with a note to release it only if the first 2 vanished. I scheduled a quiet electronic mail to myself with a full index because future me deserved an easy path if panic ever tried to fog my memory. I placed a second copy of my employment notice in a folder for my manager and the human resources team, a simple page that established my off-hours project, my personal equipment, my lack of company data, and the non-disclosure agreements I would require for any demonstration. It did not accuse, it illuminated. If my father decided to dial a phone and turn rumor into performance, the people at my workplace would already be looking at the floor plan. Callie arrived that evening with marker's tea and the kind of steadiness that turns fear into a checklist. We read every line out loud, one after another, trading the pages like a metronome. She made gentle edits that removed heat and left meaning. When I hesitated over the photo of my broken tooth, too personal, too raw, Callie spoke softly and asked the only question that mattered: does this image tell the truth without exaggeration? It did. It was a bruise in pixels. It belonged. We slipped it among the papers without commentary, a quiet answer to years of performance dressed as concern. Then we sealed the 3 envelopes and placed them side by side like little boats waiting for tide. I still sent small kindnesses to keep the surface calm. A cheerful message to my mother about table linens, an offer to drive my father to a breakfast that had already been confirmed, a light check-in with Melissa framed as support for her upcoming preview night. None of it was a lie. All of it served a second purpose: to keep their expectations inflated, to preserve the illusion that I had not noticed the cost of their affection. People who rely on control rarely anticipate evidence. They anticipate emotion, and they are ready to call it hysteria. I gave them nothing to name. The final test of any plan is not brilliance but sturdiness. I imagined failure points and then removed them. If Mr. Keller refused a handoff at the gala, I would slip the envelope to the event coordinator with a polite request to place it in his hand before the board vote. If it went astray, the office packet would arrive in the morning with a signature required. If both failed, the index would reach a trusted journalist I had not yet contacted, but could reach through a mutual acquaintance at my company. I wrote down the name and sealed it in a small card inside my records copy. I did not want spectacle. I wanted a record that could not be ignored by the people it concerned most. Quiet revenge is not about flames. It is about doors that close with a click no one hears until the lock has already turned. On the afternoon of the gala, I ironed a simple dress and chose flat shoes because balance matters when the ground is about to shift. I tucked the envelope into a plain leather bag and practiced a single sentence in the mirror. Mr. Keller, this belongs with you before the board votes. No accusations, no preamble, no speech, just delivery. In the ride downtown, Austin's winter sun bounced off glass and made the skyline look newly washed. I watched the hotel rise and thought about all the nights I had swallowed my voice to keep the peace. Tonight, I would not need a voice. Paper would speak. That is the grace of documentation. It allows you to be calm when you finally tell the truth, because the truth no longer depends on your tone. I stepped out under the awning where the air smelled like cologne and anticipation, and I held the door long enough for 2 strangers so I could feel my hands do something kind. Then I walked inside to find the man whose name was on my envelope. What happened next did not require volume. It required timing. The hotel lobby glowed like a polished promise. Winter air slipped in each time the door revolved, cool and precise, and the scent of lilies and wool coats threaded the space with ceremony. I found Mr. Keller near a pair of tall windows where the city lights looked like patient stars. He was speaking to an event coordinator, his hands still, his attention exact. I waited at a respectful distance until he turned, then stepped forward with the kind of calm that lives on the far side of panic. I offered the manila envelope as if it were no more than a program and said the single sentence I had practiced, "Mr. Keller, this belongs with you," before the board votes. No accusation, no theater. He looked at me, not through me, and something in that small courtesy anchored the moment. He took the envelope and asked quietly if the timing was urgent. "Yes," I said. And then I said nothing else. He did not open it in a rush or in the middle of the room. He thanked me, excused himself with a nod to his coordinator, and moved toward a side hall where a modest sign read "Private." The music from a small quartet rose and fell like measured lungs, and the clink of glassware stitched soft seams through the chatter. I stood at a cocktail table I would not drink from, and watched the mirror of the lobby without staring at it, tracking the door to the private hall with the stillness of a runner at a line. I thought about every small step that had led here, typed memos, careful timestamps, a camera that turned a front porch into a witness. My hands were steady. When fear tried to draft me into old habits, I reminded it that paper would be speaking now, and paper does not tremble. Someone tapped a microphone, and the room gathered around a low stage, dressed in navy cloth, the kind of staging that makes ordinary speeches feel like ceremonies. My father drifted toward the front with that practiced ease of a man who believes the light exists to find him. My mother's smile brightened one shade too white, as if she could choreograph approval by force of shine. Melissa hovered with a phone held low, ready to collect proof that she had been in the right room at the right moment. I stayed near the back where the air felt honest and watched the private door. It opened. Mr. Keller returned with the envelope in one hand, pages reassembled, expression composed. He looked first at the stage, then at the crowd, and then at my father with the clean, neutral focus of a person whose duty is not opinion, but stewardship. The announcements began all bright gratitude and community language recognitions, handed out like careful stones. My father's name hovered near the agenda, a silent drumbeat, and then the shift arrived without flourish. Mr. Keller stepped forward, thanked the sponsors, and said there would be a brief housekeeping item before the board vote. He did not glance at the papers in his hand. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the steady register of a person replacing a broken hinge so the door will close properly again. He said that the chamber had received information relevant to tonight's proceedings. He said that stewardship requires prudence, and prudence requires integrity. Then he turned slightly toward my father and delivered a sentence as simple and irreversible as a stamped date. "Your name does not belong on our board, Tom." For a second, the room forgot how to breathe. Chairs did not scrape, not yet. Conversations did not resume. The quartet did not try to smooth the pause with music. The silence felt both weightless and heavy, the way snow feels before a roof remembers gravity. My father's face learned a new language and hated the teacher. My mother lifted her chin as if elevation could argue with air. Melissa's phone tilted, then lowered, then disappeared into her clutch like a plan reconsidered. Around them, posture changed by degrees. People who had been leaning in to greet now leaned away in a soft, unmistakable rearrangement of alliance. No one shouted. No one demanded evidence. The evidence had already done what evidence does when you let it speak first. The sky beyond the tall windows was still its bright city blue, steady and indifferent. What I felt was not triumph. It was a small returning of weight to the right shelves. The quartet resumed with a piece I could not name, and the program flowed around the gap as water skirts a stone. A few minutes later, an event coordinator came to the microphone with pleasant updates about seating and silent auction items, and the room settled into that polite hustle that saves face by moving on. My father did not move on. He stood too still and too small for a man who likes to perform size. My mother turned to someone who had always laughed at her jokes and discovered that laughter has a bank account and it had just closed. Melissa touched her hair, a reflex born of mirrors, not cameras, and blinked fast. I did not leave. Leaving would have looked like a confession I did not owe. I remained exactly where I had been near the back with the honest air, and I watched the space rearrange itself without my help. That is the part I want you to understand if you have ever begged a room to see what it did not want to see. You can show up with your heart raw and your voice shaking, and the room will grade your pain for tone. Or you can refuse the audition and let documents walk in first, let a steward read them in private, let a simple sentence land in public. The truth does not always need your phrasing. Sometimes it needs your patience. The next movements were as quiet as the first. A board member who had circled my father earlier became very interested in the dessert display. A neighbor waved at my mother from a distance, measured in new caution. A local business owner who had asked for my card weeks ago found me near the back and, without saying why, handed me his and told me to call if I needed anything. The quartet cycled into a piece that sounded like rain warming into music. I thought about a photograph of a broken tooth tucked into a stack of pages and felt the old ache in my jaw give a single pulse and then go quiet as if it understood that it had been seen. When the speeches ended, the crowd shifted toward the exits with the soft confusion of a flock gently redirected. I let them go first, then followed at a distance, my steps unhurried, my hands empty. Under the awning, the air tasted newly cold. The city hummed as if nothing important had happened, which is how cities protect the private revolutions that save people's lives. I saw my parents near the curb, faces arranged for a narrative that had just lost its author. I did not speak to them yet. The night had one more lesson to teach about silence and aim, and I wanted the sidewalk to be the classroom. I will tell you that part next. The sidewalk under the hotel awning felt like a stage that had forgotten its script. The night air pressed cool against my skin, a clean line after the warm blur of the ballroom. My parents stood near the curb where the valet lights skimmed over cars and faces. My father held his jaw the way men do when they are trying to clench the world into agreement. My mother's smile had the shine of lacquer and the cracks of something older underneath. Melissa hovered half a step behind them, eyes flicking between the entrance and me as if she could will a different ending into existence by choosing the right angle. I did not deliver a speech. Speeches feed a drama they had rehearsed for years. I stepped close enough for courtesy, and not so close that their gravity could bend my spine. I said my father's name, then my mother's, then Melissa's, each like a greeting and a goodbye. From my bag, I took a small photo sleeve and slid out one picture. It was the image I had debated, including the one Callie and I finally placed among the pages because truth without a body can be dismissed as a mood. My broken tooth looked back at us from a winter years ago, my lips swollen, my eyes steady. I did not ask if they remembered. I said only, "This is where it started." My father inhaled like the first seconds before a storm, and then tried to lower his voice into that reasonable register abuser's favor, where their history sounds like a misunderstanding and your memory sounds like immaturity. He offered a thin apology with conditions stapled to it. He said, if I had been clearer, if I had not been dramatic, if I had not provoked, if I had trusted his guidance. Each "if" was a key that did not fit any door I knew. My mother reached for her pearls like they could anchor the moment back to a safer shoreline. She said all families have conflicts and that the chamber had been rash and that image can be repaired with the right friends. Then she leaned in and let the sneer back through her pretty voice, repeating her favorite catechism about parasites and obedience as if the power of repetition could refresh its magic. I understood the invitation. They wanted a scene so they could point later at my volume and ignore their record. I kept my voice even and my sentences short, the shape of a person who had practiced saying no as a complete thought. I told my father that any communication about me or my employment would be met by my workplace's legal team, and that I had already notified Human Resources of anticipated calls. I told my mother that the charity would conduct its audit and that I would not be their translator. I told Melissa that I would not loan a card, not temporarily, not under any name, not for any room that needed a borrowed gloss to make her feel invited. I told all three that I would not be at the house unannounced again, and that all future communication could arrive in writing. I was not giving them ultimatums. I was labeling shelves. Melissa stepped forward with a tremor of outrage that had always won her small victories. She said I had sabotaged her opportunity, that women should support women, that I had embarrassed the family on the brink of something important. I let her finish. Then I said the quiet sentence I had carried for years like a coin I could not spend: I will not pay for my own erasure. She blinked, as if the words had thrown light from an angle she did not recognize. My mother's voice sharpened with the brittle edge of entitlement denied. My father called me ungrateful and said family is supposed to close ranks. The blue of the city sky beyond the awning did not dim. It never does. The truth is indifferent to weather. I placed the photo back in its sleeve and returned it to my bag. There is a kind of victory that looks like shouting and a kind that looks like leaving. I chose the second. I told them I hoped they would take care of themselves. I wished them a safe night. I turned and walked to the corner where the traffic light counted down to a crosswalk I did not need to rush. It felt like stepping off a ferry and onto solid land after years of pretending the deck did not move. Behind me, I heard my mother say my name in the tone that used to reel me back. It had no hook left in it. As I reached the far curb, my phone vibrated. Messages layered themselves in tidy bubbles, missed calls, voice notes, emails. I did not open them, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because restraint is part of the new architecture. Let people's panic breathe by itself, and it will say things urgency keeps hidden. The hotel's glass doors sighed shut. A gust lifted the hem of my dress and then set it down again. I put my hand against my jaw for a second, not to check for pain, but to honor the girl who paid that dentist and kept going. Quiet revenge is not about triumph. It is about balance restored in rooms that mistook silence for consent. I walked toward the corner where the rideshare queue snaked into a thread of headlights, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not plan what I would say if I were asked to justify wanting a simple, ordinary life. The night had already said enough. I would let tomorrow speak in another language, one my family had always underestimated consequences. Morning is a truth serum. It strips last night's costumes and leaves the room in its real clothes. When I woke, my phone was a small crowd, calls from my father stacked in a column each, followed by a voice note in the softened baritone he used when he wanted to sound like the reasonable one. Messages from my mother began with concern and slid into condemnation, a sequence that felt rehearsed. Melissa wrote in exclamation points disguised as kindness, promising she could fix this if I would just confirm a few things for the right people. I made coffee and did not answer. Silence kept the shape of a boundary better than any paragraph. By late morning, a ripple moved through the networks my parents had tended like tomato vines. Invitations thinned. A client who always reposted my mother's charity captions did not. The homeowners association chat went respectfully quiet. A neighbor who often delivered muffins instead sent a very short text, acknowledging that an audit had been announced and that she hoped everyone was well. When I opened my professional profile, I watched connections unspool from my father's page, a polite unraveling measured in the absence of birthday congratulations and the sudden muteness of people who had once crowded his comments. A longtime golf partner moved from weekly photos to old memories, then stopped posting him at all. Reputation in our pocket-sized world did not explode, it evaporated. The charity board issued a careful notice by early afternoon routine review, updated controls, a temporary pause on certain disbursements. They did not use words like irregularity, but the space where that word should have been was loud enough. Depositors asked questions. The treasurer's email sent to my mother used phrases like documentation and verification and full cooperation. Melissa's event, her gleaming preview night that was going to place her beside brand directors, sent an apologetic message stating that capacity had reached its limit and that her registration could not be accommodated due to prior account activity. She posted a vague story about jealous people trying to dim her light, then deleted it when comments asked about charitable transfers by name. The archive on my hard drive did not gloat. It simply existed, a quiet lighthouse that had done its single job. Around mid-afternoon, anger arrived, dressed as confusion. My father called to say there had been a misunderstanding at the gala, that a smear had been timed to humiliate him, that people who had been his friends for years would see through it once the noise died down. He asked politely, then firmly, if I had spoken to anyone. I answered that I had delivered documents to a person charged with protecting the integrity of the board and that any further questions should be directed to the chamber office. He asked if I had any idea how much damage I had done. I told him the damage had been done the moment money moving from the charity account found its way to Melissa's personal bank. He exhaled like a man who had been kept waiting for a table. He said this could have been handled in-house. That phrase had carried me for years into a smaller life. It finally sounded as small as it was. By evening, the apologies began that particular category of apology that spends more words on your reaction than on their action. My mother wrote that she wished I had spoken to her directly before making a scene, that I had humiliated her in front of women whose opinions mattered, that I had shown no loyalty. I typed and deleted 3 times and settled on the sentence that fit, "Accountability is not humiliation." She read it, then sent an old photo of us at a summer fair, sticky and smiling. It should have melted me. It did not. Nostalgia is a tool like any other, and in the wrong hands, it can become a leash. That night, the charity posted a second note affirming cooperation with a third-party reviewer. The words were bland on purpose, as institutional words should be, but the shape beneath them was not bland. The family brand that had relied on pristine captions was undergoing a cleaning it had not scheduled, and you could hear the quiet of a community taking a step back to watch what the truth would do. Meanwhile, my own steps were deliberate. I prepared a short summary for my manager and the Human Resources Department that restated my independent project, the documentation I held, and the possibility of defamatory calls. I did not accuse my father by name. I did not need to. Protecting my work was not an accusation. It was an affirmation. I set the email to send the next morning not as a performance, but as a continuation of the same discipline that had brought me here, document, inform, proceed. As I turned off the kitchen light, my phone blinked once more with a new message from Melissa. She wrote that she could undo everything if I would just loan her something very small for a very short time, promising a glamorous photo of us at her event as repayment. I felt the old reflex tug the muscle memory of saving the story by spending my own resources. Then I pictured the ledger I had built, the slight lines marching toward a conclusion no one could deny, and I heard my own voice from the sidewalk again, "I will not pay for my own erasure." I set the phone face down. Tomorrow would bring the professional piece of this. Tonight, quiet would finish its work. The office at mid-morning had its own weather-dry air keyboard, clicks the feigned nonchalance of people who have read headlines and know better than to mention them. I walked to my manager's door with a folder that looked unremarkable and carried the weight of an anchor. She closed the door and let me sit without performing surprise. That small kindness steadied the next 10 minutes. I placed on the desk a single-page notice that affirmed my off-hours project, the personal equipment used to build it, the absence of company data, and the non-disclosure agreements that would govern any demonstration. I explained without flourish that a family member had a history of threatening to call my employer with accusations. I said I expected calls and that I preferred to inform Human Resources and legal before any rumors tried to arrive wearing urgency. My manager thanked me for the clarity. She had the kind of face that makes the truth feel like a document and not a confession. She asked if I felt safe. I said yes, because safety for me was less about distance than about structure, and the structure was in place. She brought in a representative from Human Resources who listened in the quiet way of people who understand that the right response starts with not filling silence. I handed over a copy of my notice for their files, and we outlined a simple protocol. Any call about me would be logged, caller identity verified, and the matter routed to legal for follow-up in writing. No arguments, no hallway debates, paper only. The Human Resources representative asked if I wanted security on alert. I said thank you, not at this time. The point was not to escalate. The point was to remove the oxygen from chaos. Before lunchtime, the first call arrived. The receptionist forwarded a note to legal and then to Human Resources. A man identifying himself as a concerned community member claimed I had misused company resources for personal gain and that my behavior reflected poorly on my employer. Legal requested a written statement with specific details. None arrived. The file now contained not just my proactive notice, but a documented attempt at defamation. The shape of the old threat had just become a small, dull object in a folder stripped of performance. In the afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk and asked if I needed time off. I said I preferred to work. Work makes me remember who I am when other people are busy rewriting it. She smiled and left me with a final sentence that felt like a handrail, "Thank you for bringing structure, not drama." That evening, as I walked out under a sky the color of clean paper, my phone buzzed. My father had sent an email with a subject line reading, "Moving forward." Inside, he described the gala as a misunderstanding fueled by jealous parties, insisted that my documents mischaracterized simple family loans, and recommended we all present a unified statement to the chamber, clarifying that no harm had occurred. He CC'd my mother and Melissa. My reply was one line, "Please direct any questions to the chamber and to the charity's audit as appropriate." There is a special relief in watching a person's favorite weapon fail to ignite. He wrote again, angrier, saying, "I would regret hanging family laundry in public." I did not reply. Laundry is only embarrassing when it is dirty, and you insist on wearing it to dinner. Later, Callie and I sat on my couch with takeout and the kind of silence that feels like music. I told her about the human resources meeting and the legal protocol and the first call. She nodded, pleased at the ordinariness of it all. Quiet revenge had done its design work. No chases, no shout-fests, just doors closing with soft clicks in the places where yelling used to live. As we flipped through a comedy special we were not really watching, I caught myself breathing without measuring. That is when I knew the plan had traveled from my head into my life. It was no longer a series of steps. It was a different room. Before sleep, I opened my email once more. A message waited from a local business owner I respected, the one who had slipped me his card after the gala. He wrote that if I ever wanted to demonstrate my routing tool in a controlled pilot, his team would sign non-disclosure agreements and offer feedback. It was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was an opportunity anchored in paperwork and trust. I closed the laptop and turned out the light. My phone lay dark. The night had its own gravity again, and for once it pulled me toward rest instead of rehearsal. Consequences have their own choreography, and my family had never learned the steps. Over the next week, my father tried to power the narrative with the same fuel he had always used, insistence. He met old acquaintances for coffee and delivered a stripped-down story about a daughter who misunderstood a board that overreacted enemies jealous of his trajectory. But coffee shops have ears, and communities have memories, and the details inside that manila envelope had already taken root in better soil than gossip. Invitations dried into polite deferrals. A local sponsor he had courted stopped replying. An old friend who once looked to him for introductions sent a cautious text wishing his family well and left it at that. He could not hear the message, but it was there. Reputations built on pressure are as brittle as spun sugar. My mother responded differently. She crafted long notes to people who prized graciousness, wrapping barbs in bows. She invoked the cost of my supposed disloyalty, the shock of being ambushed, the impropriety of airing family matters among civic circles. She attached photos from older events where her smile still held. She asked for coffee with women who believe every problem can be solved with the right brunch. Some agreed to meet. Over avocado toast, she attempted to recast the charity transfers as bookkeeping errors and the doorway recordings as invasions of privacy. But a truth about leadership is that the room is always watching what you do when you believe no one is. The recordings did not shock our neighbors. They confirmed them. Melissa tried a third path speed. She threw herself at the next opportunity with breathtaking optimism, rewriting the failed preview night as a scheduling mix-up and scanning for a door she might slip through if she ran fast enough. But credit histories in our country are slow clouds, not breezes, and a pattern does not become a coincidence because you wish it to. She called me twice with a new version of the same request, a short-term loan for a refundable deposit, a chance to reset her luck. When I did not answer, she posted a long missive online about forgiveness and family and women who cannot let go of the past. She meant me. The comments did not land as she hoped. A follower asked gently about the charity audit. Another asked what it means to borrow without permission. She deleted the post and replaced it with a grainy, inspirational quote about strength. Watching her manufacture a lesson where accountability should have stood felt like being handed a plastic flower at a graveside. One afternoon near the end of that week, Mr. Keller sent a brief note through the chamber list thanking members for their professionalism and confirming an interim process for nominations. He did not mention my father by name. He did not have to. The vacancy hung in the air not as a scandal, but as a solved problem. My father showed the email to my mother and declared that he would be back in the running next quarter once people calmed down. She pursed her lips in a way that used to impress me. Now it looked like someone trying to keep water in a broken glass. There was one conversation I agreed to take, not because I owed it, but because closure sometimes deserves a witness. My father asked to meet in a public park, framing the request as a chance to clear the air. I chose a time and a bench near the water, the kind of place where the city softens into a human scale. He arrived in a suit that read as armor. We sat. He opened with the language of negotiation. Mistakes were made. Reputations our delicate families should present unity. I listened until the rhythm became a loop. Then I said the only words he had never calibrated for: there is no negotiation. I described my boundaries again in plain language: no financial access, no unannounced visits written, communication only, no contact with my employer except through official channels. He called me cruel. I said clarity is not cruelty. He said I was throwing away my family. I said I was ending a contract I never signed. After a few heartbeats, he stood, adjusted his jacket, and told me I would regret this. Regret is a story narcissists sell as a fate. I watched him walk away and felt only the lightness that follows a returned key. As for my mother, we did not meet. She preferred the stage of a group. She sent a message that read like a sermon and ended with a single line that would have undone me years ago: "You are breaking my heart." I stared at it until the old shimmer of guilt rose and cleared like a passing fever. Then I wrote back with care. I said I loved her enough to stop participating in harm. I said I wished her peace. I said I would not be engaging beyond written messages, restricted to necessary matters. She replied with a paragraph about respect and then a quote from a book she had never read. I closed the thread. There is a difference between a pause and a boundary. One begs to be negotiated, the other does not. Meanwhile, the charity's review advanced. I learned about it the way everyone did, through careful updates that named process and not people. In those sentences, I could feel the relief of volunteers who had wondered about numbers and lacked the power to ask. Accountability, when finally invited into a room, makes everyone a little taller. At night, I slept. Morning no longer hurt. And in the spaces where panic had lived, something else took root. The realization that life after a storm is not about rebuilding the same house. It is about drawing a new map. I moved a few weeks later, not across the world, just across the river, and a little south into an apartment off South Congress, where the light fell differently, kinder somehow. The place was small enough to keep honest and large enough to grow in. I chose a sofa that did not carry the ghost of any argument, and a thrifted dining table that begged for ordinary dinners. Plants grouped against a wide window like a choir learning a hopeful song. I kept only one picture on the entry shelf: me at Lady Bird Lake on a spring morning, hair a mess, smile uncurated. Sometimes we do not need new continents. We need a room we are not required to apologize to. Work steadied into its familiar rhythm, and my off-hours project took on a life that felt like both a promise and a boundary. Trent introduced me to the business owner who had written after the gala. We sat in his conference room with his operations lead, signed non-disclosure agreements in careful ink, and mapped a tiny pilot that would test the routing tool against a few stubborn inefficiencies. The parameters were clear sample data, only time-boxed documented outcomes. A week later, a number on a whiteboard told a modest story. I loved more than applause minutes, saved fuel, spared drivers home earlier to their own tables. The owner offered to write a testimonial pending a longer run. I filed the paperwork with the same reverence I once reserved for other people's approval. This, I realized, was the opposite of begging to be seen. It was choosing where to stand. Callie kept being Callie, the kind of friend who replies to your good news with a grocery list for a small celebration, and to your bad day with a dry joke and a walk. We wandered the neighborhood on warm evenings past murals and music leaking from doorways, and practiced the art of living past a story that once tried to define you. She asked sometimes if I missed my family, and I answered honestly I missed the idea of a family more than the people who had played those roles. Grief for an idea is real. It moves through the body slower than anger and gentler. And if you let it, it leaves space behind space you can plant with new traditions. One of those new traditions was therapy on Tuesday afternoons, the hour where language learned another job. My therapist did not ask me to forgive, she asked me to describe. We inventoried the lies I had been taught to tell myself. Quiet is cowardice, self-preservation is selfishness, documentation is petty, and then we retired them like uniforms that no longer fit. We talked about the photo of my broken tooth the way curators talk about artifacts, not as a wound to stare at, but as a piece of history that explains a culture. We talked about love as a verb, not a debt. I left those sessions feeling neither vindicated nor condemned, only oriented. It is a quiet miracle to know which way you are facing. There were small moments of awkward grace, too. I ran into the Homeowners Association president at a coffee shop, and she did what decent people do when community and conflict meet at a counter. She nodded, asked about my work, and did not ask about my parents. The absence of gossip was its own kindness. Later that week, a neighbor from Westlake Hills sent a message about a box mistakenly delivered to my former address. I arranged a pickup time that did not require anyone to perform. The box held old cookbooks of my grandmother's that my mother had stored and forgotten. I cried a little when I opened them, not from longing for the woman my mother chose to be, but from gratitude for the women before her who loved in recipes and not in reputations. I baked one of those breads on a Sunday, the house filling with a smell that says home regardless of who claims the deed. Meanwhile, my father tried one more maneuver that would once have yanked me back into orbit. He sent a letter asking for a meeting to discuss family assets and obligations. The language was polite and legal and threaded with threat. I scanned it into my records, replied with a short note restating boundaries and offering to forward any estate questions to an attorney if he wished. He did not write again. The silence that followed did not ache. It rested. My mother sent a holiday card months later with a printed quote about forgiveness and a photo where the three of them smiled like a catalog. I placed it in a drawer and did not reply. Some doors must stay closed not as punishment, but as architecture. On a warm night near the end of spring, I walked the boardwalk along the lake with the city lights stitching themselves into a new story behind me. I thought about the envelope, the ballroom, the sidewalk, about the girl on the gravel and the woman at the table building a map. The arc was not cinematic. It was structural. The best justice often is. I sent a message to Trent with an update from the pilot and a thank you that did not try to pay him back, only to witness what he had given validation. Then I texted Callie to come over for bread and a show. We ate with our hands and laughed with our whole lungs. The future did not feel like a cliff anymore. It felt like a road I had paved with patience paper and the refusal to turn pain into a performance. I want to end where the story began, but looking in the right direction this time. Thanksgiving used to mean performance to me. Polished, silver, polished smiles, the ritual of making a home look like a magazine spread so that any stain could be called a design choice. Now it means something simpler, gratitude as a practice, not a photo. On the next Thanksgiving after the gala, I made a small dinner for a small table. A roast chicken that did not require 5 kinds of mustard, cranberries that tasted like fruit instead of achievement. I set 1 extra plate for the parts of myself I had left behind and welcomed them home. It sounds sentimental. It felt architectural. If you are listening because someone in your family taught you to mistake silence for safety, I want to offer the map I built. Do not argue with performances. Document them. Write down what was said when it was said and what it cost you. Put the dates in words. Keep your records plain and your heart honest. When the time comes, let the right room hear the right facts first. If that room is a board that governs reputation, then deliver the facts to its steward. If that room is your workplace, prepare human resources and legal so rumor cannot arrive disguised as urgency. If that room is your own mind, bring your therapist a language that has not been pickled in someone else's shame. You do not need to be loud to be free. You need to be clear. I will not pretend there are no losses. Estrangement is not a slogan. It is a bruise that fades and sometimes returns in weather you cannot predict. I missed birthdays I would once have elbowed my way into. I missed the temporary peace that comes from playing along. I missed the version of myself who believed endurance was love. And yet, in the space those losses made, other things grew. Work that belonged to me, friendships that did not need me to bleed to prove loyalty rooms where I could set down my bag and trust the air. The charity carried on now, stitched with better controls, the board seat filled by someone whose name did not rest on sand. My sister found smaller circles where mirrors still clapped back applause, and I wish her gentleness even if she mistakes it for distance. My parents learned the hard lesson of gravity: when the scaffolding of image falls, only what is built on truth remains standing. I promised at the beginning of this a line and a date. Here it is again, not as a curse, but as a calibration. You taught me obedience on Thanksgiving Day, November 26th. I taught you consequences on Thursday, December 17th. Between those two markers lies the work of my life, the decision to stop paying for my own erasure and to start investing in my own existence. If greed has ever blindsided you in the quiet square, Foot called family, drop your city in the comments so my team knows where you are listening from, and if you needed this story, subscribe so you do not miss the quieter twists we keep for the end. There is one more message from Melissa. I have not told you about a short voice note sent months later, the kind of apology that sounds like a rehearsal. I did not reply. Sometimes the best finale is not an echo. It is a door that stays closed while you walk forward, steady, not looking back for a spotlight you no longer need. Here is the last thing I will give you, a sentence you can borrow the next time someone tries to turn your boundaries into an argument. I will not pay for my own erasure. Say it softly. Say it once. Then build the structure that lets it be true. The sky will stay blue whether they like it or not. The room will reorganize itself whether they clap or not. And you will still be there when the costumes fall, holding the map, choosing the route, walking into a life that looks like yours.